welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I'm going to talk about what I think is the most underrated ability in the entire Commander format, or underrated mechanic, however you want to look at it. So, of course, we got to first talk about what underrated means, all right? Of course, it always is subjective. To me, I think this is the most underrated ability, and the reason why is because underrated means it's rated way lower than where I think it should be, just like overrated, right? If I think a card is overrated, that means people think it's a 10 and I actually think it's like a 7 or 8. And underrated, so like an underrated commander is a commander that everyone thinks is unplayable garbage and I think is pretty darn good, or at least not bad. And that would be the case with this mechanic. It is an ability that a lot of people would consider unplayable garbage in the commander format. And, you know, they're not entirely wrong with their initial assumption, but I think it can actually be pretty good. And in fact, I would wager that this is the least played ability or mechanic in the entire Commander format. You guys can let me know in the comments below if you can think of a mechanic in the Commander format that is played less than this one. So in other words, underrated here means it's right at the very bottom, and I don't think it deserves to be there. I think it's not bad. And the mechanic I am referring to is the Grandeur mechanic. And I got thinking about this because I just recently did my video about all my favorite deck techs that I've done on my channel. And one of them was the Grandeur deck that I made. This originally was a 10 deck ideas video. I talked about it in one of those videos. And then a little while later, I ended up making it an actual deck on my Janky Deck series. It is actually a really fantastic mechanic, I think. You know, outside of Commander, I think it's a really well-designed mechanic. The idea being they're all on legendary creatures, right? So this came out in Future Sight, of course, a set that is famous for having fantastic mechanics, also a set famous for having mechanics featured there and nowhere else. The idea being you have a legendary creature and then you draw another legendary creature, right? So outside of the Commander format, in 60 card formats, you get into a little bit of trouble where if I have a legendary creature in play and I draw another one because I have 4 copies in my deck, well, it's useless. I can't play it, obviously, because of the legend rule, right? This gets around that. It allows you to use that extra essentially dead card in your hand to this ability. So Torok's Bladewing, I will give as the first example here. I'm going to talk about all of them. 2 red, red, red. The casting cost can be a little confusing. It's on the side there. 4/3 Flying Haste, Grandeur, discard another card named Torok's Bladewing. Torok's Bladewing gets +X to land turn, where X is its power. So I draw another one and I discard it. So it becomes useful. The design-wise, I really like it. Unfortunately, Mark Rosewater has actually come out and said they're probably never going to touch the Grandeur ability again simply because of Commander. But I'm making this video and hopefully Mark Rosewater sees it and will realize that the Grandeur ability can actually be quite usable in the Commander format. So I will first talk about the deck that I made. And obviously these cards, and there are 5 of them, it's a cycle, they're all legendary creatures, so of course they can be your Commander. And I've seen them before, right? Korlash actually, Heir to Blackblade is probably the one that I've seen a couple of times. I have a patron with this deck. I've played against this deck, and there's a specific reason why the Korlash one is probably the most popular, where I'm actually building a Korlash deck and I'm actually using the Grandeur ability, which you can't do a lot, but there are some ways to do it. So Korlash says, discard another card named Korlash, Heir to Blackblade, search your library for 2 swamp cards, put them on the battlefield tapped and shuffle. That's a pretty great ability, right? Also ramp in black, which you don't see very often. Of course, Future Sight was kind of famous for color pie breaks. So how could somebody possibly build around this ability, right? This is why this ability is really bad in the Commander format, because it's doing the same name thing, which doesn't work very well. You can't have another card named Korlash. And of course, in order to use this ability, you actually have to discard this physical card from your hand. And obviously that means you have to have it in play. So what someone will do in their Korlash deck is they will have a Mirage Mirror, so a clone effect. Cloning is what works best here, I think. So I clone my Korlash. And of course, the legend rule here is actually going to help us because we have to choose a Korlash because we've copied it. We got 2 in play. We have to choose one to keep around. We let the original die. It goes to the graveyard. And of course, black, what it does incredibly well is get creatures out of the graveyard. Piece of cake, no problem. So now I can pick up my Korlash with some effect to get it out of my graveyard. And then now I have the original copy in my hand and I have the clone copy on the battlefield, and I can now use this ability and discard my Korlash. And if I can repeatedly return my Korlash to hand, I could probably use it a few times. So that is how it will actually work. But there's actually a lot of really great ways that it can work. And in my opinion, the best way to go about this, again, the Grandeur deck I already made on my channel was a blue-black version with Korlash and Lanessa in the 99, because I just thought it was a better option to have them in the 99, because you really need a couple of things in order to make this strategy work. There's a few different ways you can go with it, but ultimately what you need is I need a clone copy of that particular legendary creature on the battlefield and the original in my hand. That's the scenario you have to get to. There's no other way around it. With a Lanessa deck, you can just use, like, Supplant Form, funny enough, is exactly the card you want. If you happen to have a Lanessa deck, you probably have it in there. That's literally going to do what you want, right? It's going to bounce it to your hand and then create the token copy so that you can then use the ability. However, you're only using the ability once. I mean, it's a pretty good ability. Discard another card named Lanessa, Zephyr, Mage. Target player returns a creature they control to owner's hand. Repeat this process for artifact enchantment land. That's great, right? So if you can repeatedly do it, you're really going to do some damage, but doing it just once is okay. And if I go through all that trouble just to do this once, that's not good enough. You really need to repeat the options here in order to make it worthwhile, in my opinion. Now, you can put an illusionist bracers on any of these to use the ability, have it trigger more than once. You can Rings of Bright Hearth. There are ways to get extra triggers and copy the ability and all of that. Sure. But I want an engine. If I'm going to build around this, and again, I'm trying to make this ability good, and I think it is pretty good. If you can get it going, it's great. I want an engine that I can keep it going with. And in order to do that, I need to be creating token copies repeatedly, in my opinion. And Mirage Mirror, in my opinion, is not good enough because it's only until end of turn. You want something that's a permanent clone copy, which of course blue does really, really well. And I also want to repeatedly get stuff out of my graveyard, which black does really, really well. And that's why the deck I made is blue and black. I also thought Lanessa and Korlash had the best Grandeur abilities for the Commander format. However, I started going in different directions with it, and I started figuring out different things that you could do with it. And, I'm going to go over all the different options you can do with this particular ability. So, of course, we got to look at them all first. We'll go back to Taurox, which to me is the one that is both the worst ability. This ability is okay if you were actually playing a Voltron deck. But again, if you're in mono red, how are you going to do? You're in a whole lot of problems there. If you're I don't know if anyone has ever made a Taurox Bladewing deck and actually used the Grandeur ability on their commander. I don't know how you would do it. Maybe it's possible with colorless options, but for me, Taurox has not only the most useless Grandeur ability in a commander game, but also red's not offering us anything we need here. Red doesn't get creatures out of graveyards. Red doesn't copy things. It kind of copies, I guess. You could use a heat shimmer effect, but again, that's just a temporary one. We don't want temporary. We want a permanent one on the battlefield that we can reuse. So, you could try if you want to make a red version of this deck. Again, this is a method 2 deck. That the ideas I'm coming up with here are not we're building around these commanders. It is I'm building a method 2 deck where I pick and in this particular scenario, I pick the synergies and the archetypes I want to fill and the colors I want, and then I go for it. You really have to decide the colors you want to be playing here. And again, I would say really you want blue and black, although green's pretty good too. I'll get more to it. Red to me is the color that offers the least here. We definitely don't need red in this deck. And also Taurox is not that great. Baru, Fist of Krosa, 3 green, 4/4. Whenever a forest enters the battlefield, green creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample in a turn. The funny thing about that ability is whenever a forest enters the battlefield under anyone's control. So if your opponents play forest, it actually gives your team a bump. Not on your turn. It can be helpful though. It's actually not a bad ability, and I imagine anyone that builds a Baru deck is going to probably definitely be building around that ability and not the Grandeur ability at all. The Grandeur part, though, discard another card named Baru, Fist of Krosa, create an XX green worm creature token where X is the number of lands you control. That's not bad either, right? So if I can discard a couple times my Baru, I will get very easy to create an army of worm tokens, and then I play a forest and give them all +1/+1 and trample. So this could very easily be one of the win con options in the deck if you are doing a green version of the deck. Now, what does green bring to the table? Green brings, it doesn't do the clone thing super well, although I will throw Bramble Sovereign. So I have my Bramble Sovereign in play, and I cast this guy, right? This is the situation we want. And funny enough, this actually would work if you're doing just a mono green Baru deck. I cast this guy, he comes into play, I create the token copy when I get the trigger off my Bramble Sovereign, and like that's the scenario we want. And then of course, I have a copy now. I let the original die, keep the copy. This guy goes to the graveyard, but now we have to get it out of our graveyard. Well, guess what? Green does that really, really well. In fact, green does it better than black. That's what I've realized. As I was going over this, I'm like, you know what? Actually, black gets creatures out of graveyards really, really well, but green gets anything out of graveyards really, really well. The regrowth effects, right? You could fill your deck with regrowth effects, and you could do a Baru. I don't know how many clone copy options. Again, Bramble Sovereign is the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but getting stuff out of graveyards, green does that really well. So we got a great finisher here if you want green for your Grandeur deck, and also we get the green. I get stuff out of my graveyard. You also get, obviously, because you want these cards either in your hand or in play, you get the green tutor effects, right? Green tutors for creatures better than anyone else. So that's a whole lot of advantage to adding green into your deck. Of course, Korlash, I already talked about. And this one, again, black is... it gets creatures out of graveyard super, super easy. Phyrexian Reclamation, of course, is the best option. That is just repeatable. I can just sit there over and over again, getting my Korlash or any of these other ones, and just for every 2 mana and 2 life I want to play, I just keep discarding and discarding and discarding and discarding. It's actually a pretty fantastic scenario if you can get that sort of situation going. So yeah, green does have probably better just get stuff from my graveyard to my hand effects, but black really has those repeatable, I get creatures out of my graveyard effects. And of course, it's got all the best tutors, so that would be a great reason to go with black. Lanessa's Zephyr Mage, as I already talked about, has what I think is probably the best payoff for the Grandeur ability if you can get going a lot, right? For me, this is almost game ending, and as I've talked about before, I made a deck in Modern. It is probably a better option to wait till you have like 1 guy left before you start going off with your Lanessa. That's another reason to have several of these is, okay, I'm early in the game. Now I can do maybe the Korlash so I can ramp. Maybe I can do the Baru and put tokens in play. And then Lanessa I'll save for later in the game when I got 1 opponent left and I can make them return all their stuff to hand. Again, if you get into the Phyrexian Reclamation situation where I can do this 3 or 4 times in a single turn, now my lone opponent has to return 4 creatures, 4 enchantments, 4 artifacts, and 4 lands to hand. That's practically game over. Even in Commander game, that's devastating, right? So this is sort of a game ender. It can be a problem solver as well. I will also add that this is a discard ability, right? This is not, no one's going to be countering this spell here. There's no spells being cast. So that works really well. And I will also throw out, if you're thinking of what commanders should I use, because of course I did this as well, you're discarding over and over. So that also is really, really important. I'll throw out Ghost there. If you're going to do the Lanessa blue, whatever color combination, Ghost is a great one because Ghost works with the discard theme. And what I can do is I can discard my Lanessa on the first main phase and then attack with my Ghost. And because I've discarded it, right? Ghost is getting back discarded cards. I can return it to my hand so that I can do it again next turn or whatever. So that is one very easy way to repeatedly do it over and over and over again, right? That's the situation you want to get into. You can do the same with Aura Samite Guardian. This is the white one, and this originally was my least favorite, and the more I thought about it, I'm like, you know what? This could actually be really, really good and almost game ending. 1 white, human cleric, 1/3. Tap, prevent all damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. That's not bad. I mean, it's definitely a usable ability. They all, I didn't even cover all of the abilities they have stapled on them. They're okay. Some of them are okay. Korlash has Regenerate. That's a good thing to have. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of swamps you control. You could possibly close out games with it. Again, if people have a Korlash deck, that's typically what they do. They just play more of a Voltron strategy. Lanessa has X blue, tap, return target creature with mana value X to owner's hand. That's not bad. It does play into the second ability as well. Oris's ability is certainly usable. And the great thing about all these abilities is the discard part is super easy to do. It doesn't require any mana. This guy can be tapped. Any situation like that, it's super easy to just discard a card from your hand to activate the ability, right? So with Oris, discard another card named Oris Samite Guardian. Target player can't play spells this turn, and creatures that player control can't attack this turn. That's pretty darn good, actually. Now, what does white bring to the table here? Not a bunch. It doesn't bring any copy or clone effects really at all. It doesn't really bring, I mean, you can get stuff out of your graveyard. It does the graveyard recursion thing pretty well, but we don't want it in play. We want it in our hand. You can also bounce creatures here. That will work as well. So there are other ways. Again, ultimately, what you need is it in your hand and the copy in play. What does white bring to that scenario? Not a ton. However, it does bring other things to the table, namely removal and also protection, which is going to be pretty important in this strategy as well, right? You're going to have some pretty important pieces you want to keep protected. But mostly, again, just like with the Lanessa Zephyr Mage scenario, Aurus is even more so, to the point where when I get down to having a single opponent left, it's almost game over, right? If I have Aurus in play, my clone copy of Aurus in play, and the regular one in my hand, it's just game over, right? Because I will, on my opponent's upkeep, discard this, and that player can't cast spells this turn and can't attack. So what are they going to do? They draw a card and then maybe play a land and pass turn. And now on my upkeep, let's say I'm playing a Ravos deck. Ravos returns a creature from my graveyard to my hand on my upkeep. So I return my Aurus, repeat the process. Anything, again, oversold cemetery, right? There's lots of ways to do that. Just any effect that will repeatedly get a creature from my graveyard to my hand means that once I get down to a single opponent, I can just practically lock them out of the game. So this one, again, even though I would say probably black, blue, and green are the colors that give us the most that we want in this strategy, man, this ability can be just punishing, absolutely game ending. So it might be one of the best of all these abilities. It might be one of the best at closing out the game because it can completely lock out an opponent. So there you go. There is all the different Grandeur. There's 5 of them. There are a cycle of legendary creatures. Again, you can, if you want to be real fringe about it, build around them specifically. Again, if you have a color like black that does the return to my hand thing really, really well, you might be able to play a Korlash deck. Lanessa, obviously blue, doing the clone copy thing works really, really well. Returning it to your hand might be a little more difficult. Baru, Fistacrosa, actually, if you can find a few different ways to copy your Baru, getting it back to your hand from your graveyard is super easy, right? However, for me, this is a method 2 deck where I have these are the guys I'm building around. I have them in the 99. I like the blue, black, green, and white ones. The Taurox, the red one, I don't think you need. You can make a 4-color deck, 3-color deck here, 2-color deck, whatever you want to do. For me, though, this is actually a super underrated ability because I actually think it's not that difficult to build around, and the payoff can be fantastic. You guys let me know in the comments below what direction you might be going or what direction you're already going if you're possibly already playing a Grandeur deck, either with one of these guys at the helm or in the 99. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.